We began looking at worship, and in our first part of worship, we spoke of Paul's writing in Romans 12 of a living sacrifice, as opposed to the sacrifices given in the Old Testament. Now, when we think about worship today, I said that we have a lot of ideas of what worship should be. But for God, who put together many identifiers for every single aspect of the way things ought to be and should be, as all the way down to salvation, he had a plan. It says that even before we were born, that he knew us. So there was a thought. Nothing happened within history or by happenstance. So when you go back and you consider the sacrifices and you ask yourself, of all the things prescribed within worship, what is worship? The story comes to mind of Cain and Abel, the sacrifices that were required or asked of them. We know that Abel had given the better sacrifice, but it wasn't that Abel was just better in who he was or anything about it. And Cain, his sacrifice, I believe Cain put just, maybe if not the same amount of effort, maybe more effort into his sacrifice. But the fact that Cain's sacrifice was rejected and Abel's was accepted, it comes down to two factors within this. We see that it's not just, as David said, that God accepts those who come to him in a broken spirit, contrite heart. And what that means is those who come before him humbly. You see, it takes humility to come before God and sometimes do what God asks us to do, even when we don't understand it. In Abel's situation, Abel offers the sacrifice, and the sacrifice in this sense, we might look at and not understand why it would be so. And yet Cain, in a prideful sense, comes and offers his sacrifice. And I've always said he offers his edible arrangement to the Lord, and yet God does not accept it. And he becomes irate, indignant with God for not accepting it, full of pride that God would reject his sacrifice and accept his brother's. So much so that it drives him to do such a terrible act, to take the life of his own brother. Now, when we consider that, we look at our churches today. Many of us may have preferences to worship. We may have ideas to what we think worship ought to be, but it is like Jesus, when he spoke to the woman of Sychar in the moment in Samaria, he spoke in that time at the well to her, and he said that there was coming a time that God, it wouldn't be in this mountain or that mountain that he would look for those who would worship him. He said that God is a spirit, and he would look for those who would worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, part of that begins at our spirit. The rest of that, he says, continues in truth. Well, beginning in our spirit begins in humility, that God's not looking for all of the things that we may think he necessarily desires, but he's looking for you to come before him humbly. Worship, there is no such thing as prideful worship. Worship begins in the spirit of humility, acknowledging that God is higher than we are, and taking all of these things and placing God in proper position. We begin to let everything else fall away. Then it doesn't become about me. It doesn't become about you or anyone else, but it ultimately becomes about the object of our worship, which is God. So as we take part 2 today and we consider all the things of worship, look for just a moment. You can go back and you can consider even into Cain and Abel. Look at their story back in Genesis. And then you can look ahead and consider some of the things that even happens later on when Jesus talks to that woman at the well in John chapter 4. So we'll continue this as we go into part 3 of what is worship.